I've known about the Swank diet since medical school, and it was taught as one of the more popular diets that people were using in multiple sclerosis. And with an eye towards research, right away I started digging into what's out there, what kind of research is there to support it. And while I was still in school, I reached out to Dr. Swank and had the opportunity to meet him and hear his story firsthand. He had been given the assignment, go find out what causes MS. When you come back, I expect you to tell me, here's what causes MS. At the time, the person who hired him had heard that there was a lot of MS in Europe, a lot more than we had here, and this was before the World Wide Web. You couldn't just send someone an email and ask, and so he packed up his belongings and he started in southern Europe, and everybody kept saying, no, there's no MS here, you want to go up north. And so he went up, he finally found his way to Norway, and when his boat landed in Norway, he said, I'm here to study MS. And they said, no, there's no MS here, you want to go inland a little ways. Everyone in the village down the street that's where they have MS. And from an epidemiology perspective, that's an epidemiologist's dream, to have two cities just down the street from one another with people who are genetically similar, who have similar backgrounds and practices and lifestyles, but two different incidences of disease. And so that's where he ended up concentrating his research. And a theme very clearly stood out, and it was the people in the fishing villages who were consuming a lot of fish seemed to have some protection against MS, whereas the people in the more rural farming communities who were eating a lot of red meat, pork, and dairy were the ones who tended to get multiple sclerosis. And so what ended up happening is he using the science available at the time, concluded the things that red meat, beef, and pork have in common are saturated fat. And he came home and started studying the role of saturated fats, particularly animal fats, in multiple sclerosis. And that was kind of the beginning of the Swank diet for MS. Right. So the basic premise of the Swank diet is to minimize the intake of saturated fat and to eliminate, to the greatest extent possible, all processed foods. And so, keeping in mind that what processed foods were in the time that Dr. Swank described avoidance of processed foods. Processing has changed a lot in the last
quite a bit,
30, 40 years, and I just read a study there. Bolivia just produced a brochure on how to avoid processed foods and eating recommendations, and it was really neat to have them make fun of the U.S. diet and say, what you guys are calling processed, we don't even call food. A cucumber is food. A pickle is processed.
Yes.
And these things that you guys are putting in your body calling processed foods, we don't even call food.
They're not even called.
And so it's kind of a neat spin on how far and how processed our diets have become. And so I think the basic premise is got to clean up your diet. That there is very little nutrition provided by processed foods. And Dr. Swank wrote about and spoke at length about the importance of maintaining the hull on the rice, the grains that are lost when you in the process of de-hulling the rice and turning brown rice to white, or whole grain to refined grain. And so you lose so many B vitamins, among other vitamins. And the other thing I think that was really brilliant about Swank's approach was he acknowledged his ignorance, not his ignorance, but the state of the science. And in every place that he says, we've made attempts to fortify grain to make up for those lost nutrients, he is always careful to add, but we haven't figured out what all of the nutrients are. All of the nutrients that we know of that are lost, we've attempted to replace, but the reality is there are probably a few that we haven't even discovered yet. And he always took this approach that was really wise in saying, it's going to be decades before we fully understand the consequences of our actions. So when in doubt, it is always best to use the whole grain. The less processed, the better. And it's not, for any other reason other than we're just not smart enough to have it all figured out and fully understand the consequences. So the most important thing is to eliminate processed foods, to limit saturated fats, Very specifically, beef and pork are probably the two biggest offenders, both in terms of, they're high-fat meats, and so he even recommended choosing your chicken based on, white meat's better than dark meat because of the fat content. And he recommended keeping eggs to 3 a week. Very strict about, during the first year of the diet, absolutely no red meat at all. He did believe that, I remember him explaining to me that it wasn't that you couldn't cheat, it's that you, as a physician and a researcher, he really understood the human psyche, and he knew that if you give people an inch, they take a yard, and that there's some real value to spending a year learning new patterns and learning new habits. And it's not that there's anything magic about, can I have my first serving of beef at month 11 versus month 13. I mean, it's not that, he knew from his life experience that if you make a change and you stick with it for a year, you've pretty much developed a new you. You're no longer on a diet, it is your lifestyle.
So it is really a lifestyle change. We're not talking about a limited term diet.
This is not a diet. This is not a diet. And he stressed that. I mean, his opinion is this is modern. I mean, I know when you tell some people we're going to take away your boxed crackers, that they see it as a temporary restriction where they just have to white knuckle it until they can have their processed foods back. And that's not what we're talking about. And somebody who is deeply committed to fast foods and fried foods and processed foods, this isn't a diet for them, or this isn't a lifestyle for them. I mean, or if it is, they need to be prepared for a steep learning curve, because we really are talking about a lifestyle modification. This is not something where you can do it for a few months or even for the first year and then go back to drive-through fast food. It's just not going to work. What he says is you get what you put into it. And he believed very strongly that that first year should be 100% committed to giving this 100%. And he did make some allowances for, you will have birthday parties, there will be exceptions. Over time, there will be, times when you can cheat and it's not going to be the end of the world. But he really did ask people to make a very strict commitment for that first year, both to drastically and radically shift the physiology, and also to give their minds and bodies and families time to acclimate to the new them.
Right. And did he recommend support from the family to all go on the lifestyle change together?
Yes. He believed that medicine was not just something practiced by the physician and the patient, but that the entire family is involved. This is a family disease. When he introduced people both to the diagnosis of telling someone that they have MS and introduced them to the management of MS via this diet, he went out of his way to invite loved ones and family members and children to be a part of the conversation. He knew it was not going to be a walk in the park for everybody, but he also realized that the consequences and the burden, I'll say, of lifestyle modification and diet modification are more tolerable than the burden that the disease would cause on the patient and the family. And while he understood that it was going to be difficult, he really believed that it was nowhere near as difficult as a progressive debilitating disease could be on the family. And he was very open with people about, let's have these conversations, let's talk about what you have to gain, what you have to lose, what are the risks and benefits of each. But this was very much something that he did with the family. The other thing that I think is so important that doesn't get talked about very often is this is often referred to as the Swank diet for MS. And it's so much more than a diet. When you read the book, what I think is one of the most brilliant things he says is that you have to rest an hour a day. And science is now catching up. In the last 2 years, we've had 2 different studies come out on stress reduction programs in MS. And we have data now that says if you undergo some stress modification training program in MS, you can reduce fatigue, depression, anxiety, improve quality of life. And then a follow-up study actually showed that the same sort of stress modification routine statistically decreases newly enhancing lesions.
All right.
And so this is, now we're in 2014, 15, showing that this take a break, an hour a day, he has been saying all along, you have to stop in the middle of your day and take a time out and rest. I mean, respect for self, quieting that nervous system. There is a time that is one of the times when you rest that the body heals. Even last year, there was a really profound study that came out showing that only when you sleep and rest do you increase clearing of misfolded proteins and byproducts of metabolism. That the cerebral spinal fluid will permeate deeper and deeper into the brain during a period of rest and clear all that old waste. And it goes up, 17-fold over when you're awake. And it doesn't matter if it's a nap, it doesn't matter if you take a drug to get yourself to sleep, but you have to be fully resting. And so, it's now that the science 40 years later is coming out to say, hey, maybe that guy was onto something 45 years ago. We're getting more and more data that is slowly but surely supporting some of these recommendations that he made that were really speaking to this Swank lifestyle modification program.
So it's the diet with the low saturated fats, the regular rest, and the stress reduction and mindfulness.
The issue with the processing of fats, most of that has come, there are two big themes when we talk about processing of fats. One is when we take a polyunsaturated fatty acid and we manipulate it in such a way that it becomes more stable. So you can kind of tell a saturated fat from an unsaturated fat because generally saturated fats are solid at room temperature.
Okay.
And so, and what that tells us is it's more heat stable. And so, you can have coconut oil and peanut butter sitting around on your cabinet and they don't need to be refrigerated and they don't oxidize so fast. And so chemical manufacturing people figured out, hey, we can take cheap polyunsaturated oils, chemically manipulate them so they behave more like saturated fats and get things like hydrogenated oils and Crisco and things that will never rot. And so what we started doing as a way to increase the shelf life of fat-containing molecules was started using hydrogenated oils. The problem with that is that we now know we don't really have a mechanism to process them. And not only do they behave like saturated fats in the body, it's probably even worse because how they get burned as fuel and what happens is less known because they don't occur in nature at anywhere near the dose that we're adding them to foods in the 80s.
So just a great unknown there as to how those molecularly changed oils and fats react with your body, how your body processes them.
Right. And even in the conventional world, it is well accepted that trans fats are pretty much worse than saturated fats. And so I think most people are on board with that. Now I think the data and the research interests are moving more in recent years to this idea of oxidized fats. And so in cardiovascular disease research, we are spending less energy talking about good fat, bad fat, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and what is more interesting is what percentage of your fat is being oxidized.
Okay.
And so what that means is basically how rancid are you? And so, you've smelled of rancid oil before. That is what happens to oil when it gets oxidized.
Okay.
So when you smell rancid oil, you are essentially smelling oxidized oil, and it's no good. It makes a tremendous amount of free radicals. There's a lot of cleanup, and it's very inflammatory. And so there is a new trend, even in medicine, to not just measure LDL cholesterol, but more importantly, oxidized LDL. And so I think those are the two ways that we are processing fats that bear relevance to MS right now. And even in regards to unsaturated fats, Dr. Swank even thought that those should be consumed in moderation. It wasn't a free-for-all. As long as it's an oil and a non-saturated fat, you can have all you want. He actually believed that there was probably a spectrum of you know, a point at which fats became an insult to the body, and it wasn't real black and white that it was only the saturated fats. So his dietary recommendations actually suggested even moderating polyunsaturated fatty acids, plant oils. And so he said that on any given day, you should not consume more than 4 to 10 teaspoons per day of 4 to 10 teaspoons per day of polyunsaturated fatty acids. He did, however, believe that there were some fats that were especially good, and what he did say is that the very, very, very long chain polyunsaturated omega-3 oils like EPA and DHA, which are found in algae and subsequently fish, are very neuroprotective, and that has borne out in the literature over and over the years. We now can look at pictures of fetal neurons, and you can bathe them in DHA fish oil and just watch the cells that are exposed to DHA grow more. They're called neurites. And so even though neurons don't reproduce and have babies, what they can do is form new branches that makes one neuron behave more like 2 or 3 neurons might. And so there's a lot of research over the years to substantiate this idea that fish oil, which is largely comprised of EPA and DHA, actually are nutrients that have higher than normal requirements in MS. And so he thought that everyone should supplement with cod liver oil or some sort of fish oil supplement to get a higher dose of that EPA and DHA. He did recommend a multivitamin. Fish oil, the 2 supplements he was pretty consistent about recommending were a spoonful of fish oil and a multi. I think those are good ideas, and you know, he didn't have specifics about which type of multi, and you know, again, times have changed a lot. There are some consumer reports coming out saying that, you know, half of what you buy over the counter doesn't have in it what the label says it has in it, and there are some companies that make physician quality supplements, and so when I'm talking to my patients, I make sure that they understand that what you grab off the shelf at the local supplement store or pharmacy is not the same as what you might get from a pharmacist or a physician who's trained in nutritional medicine. And so there are a lot of ways to talk about what is the best multivitamin to get.
Anything else you want to cover? We've got,
I feel like we
I think we covered a lot of territory.